Why Disciplined Agile? Why would we want to use the Disciplined Agile Toolkit? So again, myself, brief introduction. Basically, I've been a project and project portfolio and program manager for more than 25 years, the last 10 of which basically I've been saying the word Agile about 9 times a day. As I mentioned, I'm one of the 2 Disciplined Agile Fellows in the world, besides Mark Lyons and Scott Ambler, the creators of the Disciplined Agile approach. I'm also an instructor, trainer, and coach in DA. And professionally, I present myself as basically an organizational agility advisor, trainer, and coach. A lot of my work revolves around training, be it Disciplined Agile. I also have done some SAFe training, some Scrum training, training for different organizations on Agile 101 and so forth, and also a course here at Montreal's McGill University. So I've been at this either from a consulting perspective or a training perspective or a coaching perspective, doing this for quite some time now. I view myself as something of an ethical disruptor. That would be my sort of my professional goal. So without further ado, let's get into the subject matter. The first thing I want to point out, and this is important because some of this material, it's certainly not inflammatory, but it could be misperceived at times. So very important, I'm not trying to create an indictment in any way, shape, or form of any existing Agile practices or frameworks here. All I'm trying to do is answer a simple question: why do we need Disciplined Agile? In order to go about answering that question in a satisfactory manner, we will be doing, the following 3 steps, or the following 3 main components of the material we're going to look at some key historical facts. There's no getting away from that. We need to ground these things in a bit of history to make sure also that everyone is sort of on the same page when we're talking about these things. Then we're going to briefly explain what Disciplined Agile is and isn't. So we can't really, we can't really get to a why without a what. And finally, in the third and final section, we're going to provide some high-level guidance mostly from my personal experience of having been doing this in the trenches for more than 7 years, on how to apply the Disciplined Agile Toolkit in the real world with clients, as a consultant or as a staff member, doesn't matter. So that would be the how. So we'll start with some grounding in historical facts. We'll briefly explain the what, and we'll get to the how. And in the midst of that, just before the how and after the what, we will have the answer in very succinct form as to why. So as promised, first we need to start with a brief history lesson, and it will be brief and it won't be too didactic, I promise. In order to understand all this stuff, and any of you who have done some reading in this space, you'll have noticed that Frederick Taylor and Taylorism is almost, you're going to inevitably come across this in your research and your reading, simply because Taylor's worldview of management and scientific management, and the fellow in the white lab coat here in the left-hand side of the picture, timing everyone's moves here. That was in the 1910, 1911 time period, 110 years ago. And yet, that every breath you take, every move you make, and employees not being considered able to make their own decisions and so on, that's still with us, unfortunately. And it hasn't gone away as quickly as we thought it would, and it certainly hasn't gone away even after 15, 25 years in some cases of the Agile movement's best efforts. We're still stuck with a lot of Taylorism in the world. So Taylorism goes back 110 years, and still we're stuck with it in people's mindsets on many occasions. Taylorism did lead to Fordism. It was successfully implemented in the secondary image here with the basic background image of the Model T assembly plant, which worked quite well up until 1927 when competition started getting stiffer. But that was a truly for folks at the time, this was the proof that Taylor's Taylor's worldview and ways of doing things worked. Henry Ford did improve it by giving his folks in better salaries and so on, but we were definitely in ultimate command and control here. As the century started to get into its midsection, we invented bureaucracy from the works of Max Weber in early 20th century Germany. Alfred Sloan at GM brought us, the company man and cascading objectives and stovepipes, and Peter Drucker, to his later regret in life, also brought in management by objectives. He had come in full circle towards the end and realized that it had probably done more harm than good, because what we were noticing was that when you tend to reward a certain type of behavior, that's the type of behavior you get. But that's these thinkers, these management thinkers, characterized where we landed in the mid 20th century. Around that time, 50s and 60s, obviously a big disruption was the beginning of IT, basically the birth of IT, and those early processes, because for the first time workers have more knowledge than their managers. Those early processes, the knowledge worker was in control. I mean, this fellow here is probably typing away straight into what we would call today production, and doesn't seem to be too fazed by it. So that was, the 50s and 60s were very much Wild West in that sense. As the decades wore on, we got into the 70s, we started seeing more predictive methods. And obviously everyone who's heard of, the waterfall method and in terms of how projects are traditionally run. Winston Royce wrote a paper in 1970 where he was actually trying to demonstrate that a waterfall approach would not work unless there was an iteration between phases. And yet the whole industry never got past page 3 of his paper, and the waterfall method was born. I mean, Winston Royce spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name. Google the waterfall incident, and you'll get, it should be it's a fun, though at the same time kind of depressing story. But that's how we wound up with predictive methods. And this continued on into the 80s, and predictive methods really ruled the roost, and we got into the big predictive methods and big waterfall, big iron here. Even though by 1986, even the American Department of Defense was starting to realize and started issuing warnings against the purely waterfall approach, much like Winston Royce himself had done. But it was too late. That ship had sailed. Everyone was into the very predictive way of doing things right up into the 90s. Then something happened. Early 90s, right into the early noughts, creeping doubt about, wow, very few of our projects are actually succeeding, was what we looked at from a global sort of business solution development / IT perspective. So what is going on? And we basically came to the realization there was this massive elephant in the room that no one was really acknowledging. I mean, mind you, it was well camouflaged. Someone had even painted it the same pattern as the wallpaper. But there you had it. The creeping doubt started in the year 2000, and that creeping doubt was very insistent, and it actually led to another disruption, major disruption, which is the Agile movement, basically. Now, the Agile movement was needed to break out of that stagnation. So, what were the precepts of those first Agilists back in 93 with XP, 94, 95 with Scrum? Let's take a look. First of all, we do need to acknowledge that it was a movement born in the IT sphere. And in many ways, it was a return to the more freewheeling 50s and 60s with our fellow typing happily away into production with no real oversight, and very sort of team-oriented, the professional knowledge worker knows best approach. But the other underlying premises also was basically, okay, we've had these predictive methods for decades. They're not working. They're just not working because the world is getting more complex as opposed to complicated, and we're just not keeping up. The failure rate of our projects, initiatives, program is skyrocketing. We've got to do something. So we realized, well, it's time to knock down the silos as well. You know, the cascading, you know, the stovepipes that were put into place at GM by Alfred Sloan. That also, along with Taylorism, is our legacy, right? That's we're used to thinking of us and them, even within the same organization. So it's time to tear that down, tear down the wall between business and IT, between business and corporate functions, between IT and corporate functions, between development and production, between development and operations. The list goes on. And finally, there's a need to relinquish that obsessive central control that characterized all of this. So what those early years and early decades of Agile actually achieve? Definitely, we've observed benefits. This particular source is from the version 1 State of Agile. Over the years, I've just picked a couple years at random here, but basically, faster time to market, better productivity, fewer defects, reduced cost, ability to manage changing priorities, something which is very difficult in a very sequential world. Business and IT alignment, and so on. So there are definitely some very observable benefits when agility takes root and is done with a modicum of diligence and mindfulness, and it's not just agile theater. But if we fast forward to 2020, and some of the main frameworks, I guess you could say, have been making some claims over the years. Scrum famously came out with their 400% productivity gain promise. A large, the scaled agile framework promises the results you see here. 10 to 50% happier, more motivated employees, 20 to 50% increase in productivity. These are, these are not wrong numbers. These numbers have been achieved in the cases of both these frameworks, but they're from case studies. So the case studies tend to be the top students, the top adopters. In 2017, there were 12 major findings extracted from a huge study with 1,500 agile projects and 1,500 waterfall projects compared. And the results, the findings of that study, are radically different from what we're seeing here, the 400% and the 50%. What that study found was that basically, those massive increases in productivity were absolutely limited to the outliers, the right-hand side of the bell curve. And the study went on to suggest a 12% increase in productivity from agile methods alone was more the norm or more the average. And it actually sunk down to closer to 5% when it was done at scale. So that's a huge difference. Now, granted, 1,500 agile projects. Well, someone could say, well, how agile were those projects really? Many of them were probably agile in name only. Many of them were probably agile theater. Yes, 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 and yes. But isn't that exactly the problem? Isn't it exactly what we're talking about? That this agility has become a buzzword applied to everything, and it's easy to do agile theater and easy to do outwardly compliant agile or agile in name only. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's semantic diffusion. The word has lost all meaning. I didn't want to use a single study, so I continued riffling through research and found also that the Business Agility Institute, Hardly, definitely an authority when it comes to looking at the business side of what agility has brought us for the last several years. They've been doing surveys for the last 3 years now, and basically, the number of participants has gone up every year. And this is what they found in 2018 and 20. The way they characterize their results is a score that basically goes to, I guess, about maybe a bit more than 10. And 2018, 2019, 2020, look at these numbers. It's the crawling. It's basically almost just the walking man. So very disappointing in all 3 years across the world. And the other thing is there's very little progress. That's sort of the frightening thing. So what are we ascribing this to? Well, I lay it partially, and this is not an indictment, but this is where it gets sort of, my talk gets sort of tricky. I understand and I appreciate that frameworks were meant to help. Frameworks, there's many of them. They were not cooked up by evil people intent on making our lives miserable and making things even more complex and complicated than they were. They were definitely meant to help. The problem is most of them, and these are some of the ones at scale, most of them are very prescriptive, right? And by prescriptive, I mean, well, they set out what you need to do. And you'll notice that all of them, all the large scaling frameworks all have Scrum in the background. So they inherit Scrum's initial flaws and limitations right out of the gate, right? So that's one problem. Add to that the fact that we've now, it's been several years, this was Martin Fowler. Martin Fowler gave us two great quotes. He gave us we've witnessed the rise of the agile industrial complex. The other great quote that Martin gave us was semantic diffusion. You know, when a word has completely has had all meaning pounded out of it by misuse and poor use. Is it really surprising, though, that there's an agile industrial complex? Let's just think about this for a second. When did Winston Royce involuntarily introduce waterfall? 1970. When was Scrum introduced? At OOPSLA 95. Look at the time elapsed there. So Agile is the same age that waterfall was the year Scrum was introduced. Are we perhaps, wouldn't it be good that if we're going to be empirical and retrospective about this, that we also look at, agility itself and wonder, right? Why would it be spared? And that's the whole problem, right? If the frameworks say that you continuously improve, but don't touch the framework itself, which is sort of a linear thinking, or sort of, it's a loop, basically. If you can't change the actual framework, then you're not actually improving. But there you have it. So going back to the Reifert study, so closer to 5% than 12% at scale, and yet everybody's going into scaled transformations. So my question here is there a new elephant in the room, and perhaps one that reoccurs or revisits us every 25 years? So what is my issue with the prescriptive frameworks then? Well, there's a couple. They need to be fully implemented, for one thing, in order to derive the promised benefits. In other words, they've been put together with a certain logic, and again, a well-meaning logic, and there are circumstances where they all work beautifully, certain specific contexts. But if you're just off the street, you need to implement one of these, chances are you're not going to get any tangible improvement until you can get like 80 to 90% alignment with the prescribed practices, which is, let's face it, the change tax on that and the suddenness of that, the bulldozer effect, it's culture will fight back, and culture will always win. So you plateau and you get a very mediocre overall result. It reminds me kind of those of you may remember, at least in North America, they used to sell these Christmas lights that, and if one of these was burnt out or loose, you couldn't, none of them would turn on. So that's what that's a good metaphor, actually. So that gets us now to DA. Now that we've set the stage, we've established that there's a bit of a problem here. So let's see what we're solving for. So what is DA? This is the PMI's actual definition. So I'm just going to read the first paragraph. It is a process decision toolkit. So what is DA not? It's not a framework. It's not a methodology. It's a process decision toolkit. And it provides straightforward guidance to help people, teams, and organizations to streamline their processes in a context-sensitive manner. Now, that seems a bit abstract. We're going to get into very, very practical illustrations of this before the talk is up. And it goes on to mention the fact that it's across the entire enterprise, and not just in IT. It's not just business. It's everything. It's the entire ecosystem. What DA really is, in that sense, it's a massive dose of option awareness. suddenly blinkingly looking out from above the frameworks and realizing there's a whole world of possibilities and ways of doing things that if you stick to the frameworks, you're going to miss. And these one-size-fits-all process decisions do not work for the most part. And again, there are contexts where a very specific framework can be helpful, but eventually you're going to need to move past it. So DA does that. DA provides transparency into options across your entire organizational system. If you look here, you've got everything from enterprise architecture to engineering, reuse with asset management, transformation, finance, vendor management. If you're signing coercive waterfall type contracts with your suppliers, yet trying to do agile on the inside, where's that going to get you, right? So everything has to be covered from top to the bottom of the house. And since we know that IT is no longer the constraint, if you just look at this value stream for a moment, the value stream begins and ends with customers. If you look at the entire value stream, if you look at the consumable solution part down here, that's where IT development and agile methods live, basically. If you look at the entire length of this circuit, even going 100% faster here will have little effect on your full lead time. So it's the old trope that what you need to reduce is your wait time, not the time that you're actually working. So that's the fundamental flaw of concentrating exclusively on IT methods, is that you're missing most of the low-hanging fruit of waste in the organization, and lead time and wait time. So this is an illustration of the heart of Disciplined Agile. It's what Disciplined Agile breaks down into objectives that are method agnostic, that are absolutely agnostic, that are things you would need to do in order to deliver any kind of project or initiative anyway. And each of these higher objectives, like this one here, for example, address changing stakeholder needs, will break down into sub decisions. For example, here, manage your work items, prioritize them, who prioritizes them, how do you prioritize them, how do you accept changes, and so on and so forth. And the way process tailoring works is this should be an open and frank discussion amongst the team and its stakeholders and amongst the various parts of the organization that have a stake in contributing to these decisions and making sure that these decisions are made in an open, collaborative, and transparent fashion. Now, this is your options with DA. What happens if you've already adopted a framework and it's a let's roll out X? Well, X comes with decisions built in. X will have made the decision for you before you can even begin. And basically it winds up, if we were able to visualize X, Y, and Z framework-wise on the using the Disciplined Agile objective trees like this, it would wind up looking like, and you could actually, I've done it here, not that I've done it for a specific framework, but this is a facsimile. You wind up with a sort of a WikiLeaks redacted document, right? All the actual useful stuff has been crossed out before you even get to it. So you wind up with what the framework has decided. So you're asked to implement practices without necessarily understanding the why, nor even knowing what the other options were. So, and again, here the choices that I made here are just for illustrative purposes. I'm not referring to any specific framework, method, nor approach here. Now, you could say, well, if every team and every part of the organization are allowed to make all of these decisions, is it going to devolve into chaos? And I say, well, no, because Disciplined Agile does bring one very simple tool, and it's probably the closest that Disciplined Agile gets to any sort of prescription, but it does say, listen, whether you realize it or not, whether you're doing Agile or traditional or Kanban or whatever you're doing, there's going to be, in any endeavor, an inception phase, an execution phase, and a phase where you transition the material or the product of your work into the hands of the customer. So let's just acknowledge that. And let's use these phases as cutoff points for very lightweight, basically milestones, but milestones that are not that are not paper-based, that are not document-based. These milestones are based upon actual progress. So if you look at the traditional phases and the Disciplined Agile phases, Disciplined Agile only drops the planning in order to put that into execution. But in the old waterfall way of doing things, you would have a project charter, and then you'd have a solution approval, which would be on paper. This is what we're going to do. So you'd have a long planning phase where we'd expect to perfect our estimation. Well, Disciplined Agile says, well, a project charter should be the time where you make sure that all your stakeholders share the same vision. You don't want stakeholders coming back just before you're going into production. They will show up with pitchforks and pitchforks and torches and keep you from going into production. Proven architecture instead of a solution approval. You should prove your architecture with code. And instead of having one big no-go decision at the end, go or no-go, then the go, no-go decisions are at the end of each iteration. And that's just basic Agile right there. So these are outcome-oriented gates and phases, and they do happen to align with PMO practices across the world for the last several decades. So here's another way of visualizing it. The methods, the frameworks, approaches on this Stacy diagram here, those of you who know a Stacy diagram, but for those of you not, it's just the green onion peeling. It goes from simple to complicated to complex to chaos. According to how volatile your scope is and how complex the solution needs to be. So these approaches, I've placed them on this very, very random, not randomly, but it's a very approximate. But just to show that waterfall can still be a very good approach when if you got something simple going that you're used to doing. Why would you change that? Why would you, if you've got teams that are working that way, let them continue. And you've got Scrum XP, as I said before, very, very appropriate for certain situations and contexts, mostly complicated, not too complex. Kanban, because it's a lean way of working, you can react a lot quicker than you could necessarily with Scrum. So I've put that more in the complex. And you've got something like, the lean startup or the startup way for large enterprises that could live just on the border of chaos and bringing chaos back into the complex. Each of these frameworks, each of these approaches, each of these philosophies are nothing but a collection of specific choices that can all be reflected within the DAD toolkit. The DAD toolkit has taken all of these into account and laid the possibilities and options that all of these provide and put them into high-level objectives. So you wind up for the first time seeing the forest for the trees and being able to choose your options. If we look at this from a scaling perspective, look at this, it's the same thing. Nexus, Safe, Scrum at Scale, less, all great, potentially great responses to specific contexts. For example, with Safe, you can see that it sits squarely in the middle, which would explain a lot of its current popularity because it's the Goldilocks solution, right? It's not as it just covers the most middle ground than of any of these scaling frameworks. So that would go, besides the marketing, this would go a long way towards explaining it. And I'm an SPC myself, and I know that this is true. I mean, there's a time and a place for it. But again, it can be easily expressed. All of these can easily be expressed as a series of transparent decisions, option decisions in DA. So that is sort of the what is. Let's get to a bit of how, and we'll end with the big why, sorry. So how do you, it's very nice that there's these, these process trees and tailoring and options and decisions to be made, but how do you actually go about that? Well, I've been doing it for 7 years with a number of clients, basically. And as we saw earlier, we know that IT is definitely no longer the constraint for organizational or business agility. So the first thing to understand, and I mentioned it earlier, DA does not view corporate functions as dragons to be avoided, the there be dragons portion of old maps, but rather views them as valued peers and partners. So that's one of the places to start, basically, is with from a practical example point of view. Where do you start? Well, again, IT is no longer the constraint, so why don't you start working with your corporate functions and your corporate control partners, many of them will be more than willing to participate in shared experiments. Your governance, compliance, finance, audit, your risk, your security, your privacy people, your HR, all these folks, all these functions, everybody has heard the call now. I mean, we've been harping about business agility and organization agility already for several years. No one is living under a rock. They're ready. They just need to be met halfway. And there are ways to do that. With governance, for example, you could work with the PMO to establish agile-friendly KPIs that allow reporting to happen, but without stifling teams and without making teams bend over backwards to create SPI or CPI, earned value calculations that aren't necessarily reflective of the way they're working. So cumulative flow diagrams and rolling average of your velocity are great ways to go. And if need be, you can actually still go with a green, yellow, red sort of reporting structure, but on high level issues like scope, value, budget, schedule, quality, and so on. But you can populate or you can trigger the decisions of the coloring based on very agile reasons or triggers. For example, here, backlog has minor changes that impact delivery of the MVP within 1 or 2 sprints. That would be a yellow, for example, in this case. So you can use agile KPIs as input data for traditional reporting strategies during an interim period. You're not forcing the PMO and the rest of the organization and all the executive to suddenly learn a new language overnight, and then ripping your hair out when they fail to do that. Your risk folks, I've actually worked in a situation where we created risk burn downs. You can actually use explicit risk management in conjunction with Agile's built-in risk management. The more you manage your risks, the better. So this is not overdoing it. From an audit and compliance perspective, DevOps, Agile's younger cousin, basically CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous delivery platforms, modern pipelines provide automatic end-to-end traceability. So that is one way of making audit a lot easier than it was back in the day when we were doing traditional and cutting and pasting traceability from one silo to the next. Agile procurement, as I mentioned earlier, if you're still signing very coercive, very traditional contracts, you're just doing it wrong. It's time. Even this is from the Canadian federal government site, basically. Even federal governments in the world are cluing into the fact that agile procurement is probably a better way to go, because it's the idea that you're leaning out your process also with your suppliers and partners. Finance, you want to get finance to the point where they themselves realize and think it's their idea. Just kidding. That you want the business to come to you and say, now, once they've been exposed to a more agile way of working, they should no longer be willing to give the IT function or any other function tens or hundreds of $1 billion for a project at once. It should be as you go funding, and as you go is based on no go decisions based on successful implementation of iterations and increments of the solution. Right? So if you find yourself being someone leading up to this, you don't try and take ownership and say finally you just say basically be noble and say fantastic. We'll fire up a pilot right away. The process tailoring workshops I mentioned earlier and showed you earlier, these are pretty involved. They can take several dozens of hours to complete for single teams or single projects. But every hour spent making these decisions in a collegiate, transparent fashion pays off in spades here. And what I usually do is I use the tool to capture the team's current process and what would they view as an improved aspirational process and why, and what's the action plan to get there. So this is not just an empty exercise. It should actually yield action plans that should wind up, as a matter of fact, as implementable stories or implementable chunks of work. and so on across the entire ecosystem. So we get to the why. Why use the DA toolkit? I've boiled this down to 3 major reasons. Number 1, because it contains everything yet prescribes nothing. So the world is open to you. You do take control over your own options. Number 2, because it is a forcing function on critical thinking. And that means it's going to work with rather than against your culture. And that is incredibly important, because anything implemented from the outside and trying to make its way into the heart of the organization will fail when it when it is not aligned with the culture. And that's been proven over time and time and time again. And finally, also very important, the fact that people are participating in choosing their ways of working, choosing their ways of doing things, and that everyone is collaboratively starting to open up. This fosters agency, fosters ownership, in other words, and therefore that fosters a very, very deep sense of engagement. In a world where only a minority, something like 17% of workers worldwide are engaged, and in fact 13% are maliciously disengaged, working to rule. This is from a Gallup poll from 2017, I believe. That agency and that engagement are gold. You need to get to that, but you can't get there without treating people accordingly. So those are the 3 reasons. That's why. So basically, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. You can reach me with the email and my LinkedIn on the screen, and have a good rest of day or evening.